Hi everyone, I'm Casey Martin from Wine Country Mica Powder and Wine Country Woodworks, and this is going to be episode 2 in the Beginner's Guide to Resin Casting series that I'm doing. This topic is going to be on coloring resins. So I'm going to be talking about dyes, I'm going to be talking about mica powders, glitters, all the different ways to color resin. I think this is going to be a really useful episode to beginners and also probably some advanced resin casters as well. Before we dive into the video, I do want to mention if any of you are looking into buying any Alumilite products, you can always use Wine Country 10 to get 10% off all Alumilite products. It helps me out and also helps you guys out to get the 10% discount, especially if you're ordering a lot. Really helpful. The other thing I wanted to mention as well is Zach Higgins and we have a podcast called the Resin Cast Podcast. It's on Apple Podcast apps, it's on Google Play for Android, it's on a bunch of different podcasting apps, and then we try to get an episode up every week or so. We're up into episode, I think 72 or 73, somewhere around there, and it's been a ton of fun, and we have a ton of episodes tailored towards beginners, advanced resin casters. We talk about what we've been up to in the shop and a bunch of fun stuff. So just kind of wanted to start the episode off with those because that is another really good resource for beginners, and we're always pumping out content on that. So definitely check that out. Okay, so the first topic I wanted to cover in terms of coloring resin is dyes. That is the large majority of what people use for coloring resin. So I, of course, use Alumilite Clear. If you're not familiar with my channel, it's a polyurethane resin. It's mixed by weight, which is a lot different than most epoxies, which are mixed by volume. Tons of videos on me casting it on the channel if you want to go check it out. But whether I'm using Alumilite's polyurethane or epoxy, or even another brand's polyurethane or epoxy, I use the Alumilite dyes. I know they work. They have every single color that you could think of and also like a fluorescent line. So those are what I use. However, a lot of people also use alcohol dyes. Those work just fine in polyurethanes like Alumilite Clear or epoxies. Those work just fine. The only caveat I will mention into alcohol dyes is that it's really hard and in my opinion probably impossible to get an opaque color with an alcohol dye, whereas with some of the more normal kind of like Alumilite dyes, for instance, if you're using a blue or a purple or even a green, it's gonna get pretty much opaque. It's gonna get really dark. And so I highly recommend those. The other alternative that also does a perfect job of getting something opaque is kind of oil-based dyes. So the brand that pops into mind for me that I've used before is Divine Island Pigments. You can kind of think of them as Alumilite dyes or just any type of dye but mixed with a white base. So it's nice and opaque, it's nice and vibrant, it's really good for like color swirls, for instance. I'd highly recommend using opaque resin for color swirls, whether that's through dyes or mica powders, which we'll talk about later, but those are a great alternative as well. So honestly, the biggest advice that I would give when it comes to dyes is to not use water-based dyes. And there's not that many out there. There's definitely not really any, at least that I know of, that tailor towards resin, because if you're using a polyurethane like Alumilite Clear or some other brands, it's not gonna cure. It's literally not gonna cure. Polyurethanes hate moisture, and if you mix a bunch of water all around in it, it's not gonna cure it. It may get tacky, but it would completely ruin your casting project. So definitely stay away from those. I know epoxy is a little more okay when it comes to moisture, but I never test it myself, but I'd honestly guess that even epoxy is probably not going to cure if you use a water-based dye. So definitely, I would highly recommend staying away from those. You can go the alcohol route, the oil-based route like Divine Island Pigments, or just the Alumilite dyes. And the reason why I'd recommend Alumilite dyes over everything is not because I'm affiliate, not because of anything like that. It's literally because there are hundreds and thousands of people that use it, and it works for everything. So I use it when I'm doing cactus juice stabilizing for dyeing wood. I use it for epoxy, like I mentioned. And I know Zach Higgins, who I mentioned on our podcast, he uses it even in his resin 3D printer. So it just is super versatile. It's used by a lot of people and trusted by many. So I would recommend using that. But there's also plenty other brands out there too with maybe some colors that Illuminate doesn't have. They'll probably work just fine as well. Okay, so before we get to mica powders, I wanted to talk about glitter. A lot of people don't talk about glitter in terms of coloring resin, but it's a total viable way of coloring resin. And I'll probably put something up here to show you guys an example. The biggest advice that I would give if you are using glitter to color resin is to use a lot, because no matter how much you use, it's still never really going to be opaque. But if you want to, for instance, use red glitter and get something that truly looks red at the end, you kind of have to use a lot, because if you only sprinkle a little bit in it and use no dye or no mica powder, it's mostly going to just look like clear resin with a little bit of sparkles with it, which is a total awesome look as well if you're going for it, but just something to be forewarned about that you're probably going to use a lot. And you know, whether it's dye or glitter or mica powder, you can always put more in, but you can't take it out after you put it into the resin. So you can always experiment by putting some in there, mixing it. If it's not to your opacity of your liking, you can just always add. Now, the other aspect of glitter, and I'll of course touch on this a lot with the mica powder as well, is you can always do all different types at the same time, right? So you can put in glitter with your mica powder. You could use a little bit of dye and then some glitter as well if you were trying to make something that was slightly translucent with a little bit of red dye, for instance, and then you wanted some, I don't know, green glitter sparkles in there. You could combine those and that would be just fine. The beauty of resin casting is the unlimited possibilities of it, and so you can do all types of crazy combinations when it comes to coloring it. Okay, so last but not least is mica powder. So I am of course going to be very biased to my company, Wine Country Mica Powders, so I'll talk a little bit about what I love about them, but the beauty of mica powders has nothing to do with my company or my brand. It has to do with that there are so many brands of it, because if you are trying to find any particular color, you can just Google it, search for it on Amazon, go to Turntex, Turner's Warehouse, you know, any of these websites that carry resin casting supplies, and you can probably find your color. If you're looking for a, you know, charcoal black, or if you're looking for a pewter silver or a sky blue, whatever, right? You can find it. And that is the beauty of mica powder. Whereas when you're trying to do really precise coloring with dyes and definitely glitters, it's nearly impossible. It can be done, right? Like for instance, I mentioned Zach Higgins. He has a bunch of proprietary blends to make perfectly matched team color blanks. That's kind of his specialty, of making color swirl blanks out of those. But that being said, if you wanted to nail a certain team color and you know exactly what type of orange it is or whatever, you can just Google that color and most likely find a mica powder for it. That being said, one of the really great aspects I like of like Wine Country Mica Powder, for instance, and a couple other brands that are, you know, in my opinion, kind of the higher echelon of them, is they have different types of colors that you can't really find elsewhere and are more unique. So a good example, and I'm sure I'll put a video up or something emulating it, is my macro color shift powders at Wine Country Mica. They are larger flaked powders, so you kind of get what that macro effect, hence the name, but they also color shift, which, you know, you can get some color shifting powders somewhere. You can of course get macro pearl in certain places, but there's never really the combination of the two kind of found anywhere. Another good example that Wine Country Mica Powders has, and some other brands have their own kind of niches as well, is the glow-in-the-dark powders. I have a green powder that glows green, and a red that glows red, and a blue that glows blue. I also have the white that glows blue and the white that glows green that a lot of other manufacturers have. But I would highly recommend, you know, looking at a brand like Wine Country Mica, or I don't know, Black Diamond Pigments, or, you know, some of these other brands that have kind of specialty powders. Because like I said earlier, when it comes to finding a particular color that's the beauty of mica powder, is that there's all these brands with all of these kind of basic colors, which look great, you know, and pearlescent and all of that. However, I would highly recommend, if you're trying to find a really cool, unique look, find some of these brands that kind of have those niche products, and it's going to allow you, like I was saying earlier, to do some type of coloring that's really unique, where you can mix some of these glow in the dark or some of these macro color shift powders with a dye or with another glitter and create a coloring effect that is really, really unique and special. The other aspect I want to talk about with mica powders, and I touched on this a little bit with glitter, but also dyes, is you can use them to your advantage in terms of opacity. So with mica powder, for the most part, if you just add mica powder, it's going to be pretty translucent, especially if you're turning something on a lathe or casting something really thin. If you're turning something on a lathe that's going to become thin, then you're probably going to get a level of translucent when it gets really thin. And especially if you're casting something thin from the get-go, you're going to be able to see it as soon as you pour it, whether or not it's going to be translucent. Sometimes that can be a desired effect. Like a lot of the times I will cast things like that, but it's also something, if you're trying to make something opaque, to be aware of. And there's a few ways you can combat this. One of the ways is to just dump a lot of mica powder in. If you add a ton, technically speaking, it's still gonna be a little bit translucent if you were to hold a flashlight up to it or something like that in a really thin portion of it. You'll see light shine through, but for all intents and purposes, even if you're casting something pretty thin, it will look opaque. So you can absolutely do that. Another route that I take a lot is I just add dye to it. Whatever color I'm doing, if I'm doing blue, I'll add in Alumilite blue dye, and then I'll add in my ocean blue or sky blue mica powder, and they'll beautifully complement each other, and I'll end up with something opaque. So the last thing that I wanted to talk about is ratios. So probably a lot of people are going to be commenting questions about more technical aspects of coloring, and I will absolutely answer those in the comment section. I answer every single comment that I get. So definitely, if you have questions that I don't cover in this episode, comment them down below, because if somebody else has a similar question, they'll probably be able to see the answer there too. But before I wrap things up, I wanted to talk about ratios. So I think, if you go to like Alumilite dyes, for instance, I think it says something like 1 drop per 1 ounce of resin is recommended. And then I don't think you can, they say that you shouldn't exceed like 6 or 7 drops per ounce. I forget the exact amount, but at the end of the day, it's pretty much up to your own discretion. Like I was saying, there's an upper threshold limit when it comes to dyes, where if you just dump like an absurd amount in, it might cause the resin to not cure properly. But that's, you'd kind of have to try to do something like that. It would be pretty hard to do. You'd have to use a lot of dye with a little amount of resin. The biggest advice that I would give is there's really not a scientific way unless you're trying to match colors. And if you're trying to match colors and do a bunch of tests, the biggest advice that I could give would be to take notes of it. Other than that, the second biggest piece of advice I could give would be to just test things out, try it out. Like I was saying earlier, you can always add more of a dye or a mica powder or whatever you're using to color it, but you can't take it out. So, if you're mixing something up, add a little bit of that powder in, stir it up, see how it looks, hold it up to the light, whatever you need to do, and then you can always add more. The other thing that I would recommend too, that's a good trick, is if you are trying to cast something a particular thickness, let's say you're just trying to cast a coaster, right? That is, I don't know, 1/2 inch thick. In your mixing cup, you're probably gonna be stirring something that's, I don't know, 3 or 4 inches tall, right? In your cup, if you're doing, I don't know, maybe a couple coasters. Get an empty cup and pour your resin into that cup the exact thickness of your coaster or whatever you're casting. Pour 1/2 inch into it. And then you can hold it up, look at it, and see what the opacity is. That's gonna let you know exactly what the opacity is gonna look like when it's in that thickness of whatever you're casting. Or if you're gonna be casting something and then it's gonna get turned into something else on a lathe or whatever, you can still do the same thing. Just put a little bit or whatever thickness it's gonna be into a cup and hold it up, check it out. If you like the opacity, great. If it's too translucent, add more powder or add more dye or whatever. That's the biggest advice that I could give in terms of testing. And like I said, just testing and trying it out is the biggest thing, and taking notes of your findings so you don't forget. So that is it for this episode, everyone. I am really excited to continue this series and continue trying to post once a week. I'm definitely going to try my best to do it. So definitely like the video if you liked it. It helps me out, helps the YouTube algorithm out, let people know who may be interested in this content as well, that it's out there. And definitely comment down below on topic ideas. I've got a bunch of great ideas from you guys already that I'm really excited to make these videos on. And this is also going to be kind of a series that's going to talk about stabilizing as well. I'm definitely going to cover that in a handful of episodes. So don't worry that, you know, we're starting with resin casting. It's going to cover stabilizing wood as well, and stabilizing resin for any of you interested out there. So definitely check out, you know, Wine Country Mica Powders if you guys are interested in getting some. Like I said, those macro color shift are pretty incredible. So like I said, like the video if you guys liked it, subscribe to the channel if you're new, and you can also hit the notification bell if you want to be notified when my videos go up. And thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.